We, we now have two classes addressed to the reconstruction of the economic order, not just its institutions, its institutional arrangements, but also the ideas that inform it. And what I would like to do in today's class is to go back over the parts of the economic program that I have already addressed and then add new parts and form a comprehensive view, stopping, of course, always all along the way. Now let me begin by going back to what has been almost the only subject of progressive politics since the Second World War, which is the attenuation of inequality in the economic order. And restate or remind you of the propositions that I advanced in this respect. I suggested a view organized around three theses, ordered in hierarchical rank. The first thesis is that with respect to inequality, structural change trumps everything else. By structural change, meaning change in the institutional arrangements of the economy and of the polity, and the ideas informing this change. So the dominant perspective of the progressives, at least since the Second World War, has been that the market order is a tremendous machine for the creation of wealth, but unfortunately it creates inequality. So we come after the fact, and through retrospective and compensatory redistribution, we ameliorate the inequalities that it produced. And this perspective is inscribed in the dominant theories of distributive justice. These theories, like the Rawlsian theory, combine an egalitarian profession of faith with institutional skepticism or passivity. And if you sum up these two elements, the institutional skepticism or passivity and the egalitarian commitment, what results from that combination is the idea that the market order will not be changed fundamentally, its arrangements will not be redefined, but we will diminish the inequality that results from it after the fact. We will diminish the inequality without reorganizing the economic order, the market order. Now, my main argument in this part of the development of the ideas is that if the inequality is far-reaching, if it has great magnitude, we will be very limited in the correction that we can achieve. Because if the correction goes beyond the very modest level, it will begin to derange the established economic practices, the arrangements, and the incentives to save, invest, and employ. And so it happens that this retrospective and corrective redistribution is necessarily very limited. And this then produces a strange result in the theories of justice. They seem to be radically committed to equality, but in practice, all they can be is a prop for the homely practices of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. That is what they come down to. And if we observe the political careers of the actual social democracies in the world, like the widely admired Scandinavian social democracy, we see that, in fact, the compensatory redistribution by progressive taxation and by compensatory redistributive social entitlements typically comes only after many decades of struggle over access to economic opportunity and political power. So it is only an accessory to what has been achieved through structural change. Now, the structural change to which I refer is not structural change in the Marxist sense. It's not the substitution of a whole indivisible system by another indivisible system, capitalism in quotes by socialism in quotes. The real structural change in historical reality is always fragmentary. It's piecemeal, it's part by part, and it's step by step. So that's what comes from that. So the argument is that's what has absolute priority. That's what, in fact, overrides, with respect to inequality, everything else. So, for example, changes in the labor laws, changes in the corporate laws, changes in the relation of government to business and to labor, modifications of actual collective power of business or labor or government in relation to them. That's what matters. The second proposition is that with respect to the budget, on both the revenue-raising side and the spending side, we have to take both sides into account simultaneously. We can't evaluate the redistributive effect of the budget simply by looking to the revenue-raising side. And what matters is, the claim is that what matters fundamentally most is the aggregate level of the tax take, rather than the progressive profile of taxation, the revenue-raising side, and how it is spent. So I emphasize the enigma presented by comparative fiscal experience. The rich country that is most unequal by far is the one that makes its tax system rely preponderantly on the progressive taxation of personal income, the United States. And the European social democracies, which are much more equal than the United States, paradoxically rely on the regressive taxation of consumption, regressive and indirect taxation of consumption, especially through the flat rate comprehensive value-added tax. And what is the solution to this enigma? The solution is that what matters is not the progressive profile of taxation, but the aggregate level of the tax take. The basic reason why the American system is less redistributive is that the American government takes in at least 10% of GDP less than its European counterparts. The 10% more that the Europeans take in taxes, they spend redistributively. And then everything that they lose by way of redistribution, by relying on a regressive tax, the VAT, they gain in double through the way in which they spend. And the greatest historical achievement of European social democracy has been to achieve and maintain a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities, their health, their education, and their physical integrity. Now, what does the reliance on the VAT have to do with that? The argument is that the VAT is conceptually a neutral tax. In its purest forms, it's completely neutral with respect to the system of relative prices. And because it is completely neutral, because it takes a constant proportion of the transformation of every input into an output or its value, it makes it possible to maximize the tax take while minimizing the economic trauma of taxation. And that is the fundamental explanation of this paradoxical feature of the relation between the fiscal experience of Europe and the fiscal experience of the United States. And then the third proposition down the rank order is that if we nevertheless want to use taxation redistributively and not rely solely on a regressive tax, we should define with clarity what the objects of direct taxation should be. And the two principal targets, I argued, are, on one side, the accumulation and exercise of economic power, and on the other side, the hierarchy of standards of living. The accumulation and exercise of economic power is very hard to reach through taxation, but the best way to reach it, to the extent that we can reach it, is at the moment of death, through the taxation of inheritance or anticipated inheritance through gifts inter vivos in the family. The other target, the hierarchy of standards of living, we can hit through an individualized consumption tax, and the name, its name in the technical literature is the Kaldor tax. So that's a tax that subtracts from the aggregate income of the individual, the income to labor and the income to capital, invested saving. That difference between the total income of the individual and the invested saving is what the individual spends on his standard of living. And that's what we tax on a steeply progressive slope. So you could say, but beneath a certain level, the individual pays nothing. In fact, he receives. That's the negative income tax. As you go up the level of spending on one's standard of living, the tax rate increases sharply, and at the top level, the sky's the limit. The only limit is political will and power to impose the tax. In principle, for every dollar he spends on himself, we could require him to pay 5 to the state. The top tax rate would then be 500%. And I observed that this tax, the Kaldor tax, has no technical difficulties of administration other than the difficulties of the income tax. It's no different than any other declaratory tax, and nothing prevents it from being applied if the real aim were to maximize the redistributive impact. Now, this very simple argument stated in these three propositions is for the purpose of showing that that retrospective and compensatory redistribution is not as mysterious as it first appears, that it can be achieved even though it has a subordinate place in a progressive program. So that's a summary of my argument with respect to compensatory redistribution. And I wonder whether you've had a chance to think about it and whether you'd like to make a comment on it or ask a question. Now, if not, I would go on to the next element in this collection of ideas, which is the first of three structural problems or frontiers in the reorganization of the economy. So the first problem is the relation of the vanguard, the advanced sector, to the rest. The second problem is the relation of labor to capital. And the third problem is the relation of finance to the real economy or to the system of production. And let's go back over each of these problems. Now, in the last class, last week, I addressed in detail the nature and evolution of the knowledge economy, the relation of the advanced sector to the rest, that first structural problem. And I presented a view of what are the cognitive, educational, the moral, social, and the legal institutional requirements for the gradual development of a knowledge economy for the many to replace the knowledge economy for the few. And that substitution of the knowledge economy for the few by the knowledge economy for the many would be the most important structural change that we could achieve in the present historical moment. And I tried to describe its content and, with respect to the legal institutional requirements, the stages for the development of this project. Now let me go back over this in a somewhat different way by describing the short term, the medium term, and the long-term content of this project. In the short term, especially in the United States, the priority is to confront and master the platform oligopolies of Silicon Valley. These are the most valuable businesses in the United States and in the world, measured by market capitalization. And they cast a long shadow over the whole knowledge economy by their tremendous influence on economic practices and on political power. I argued that they are in fact an anomaly, that they're not representative of the knowledge economy in its present form. The knowledge economy in its present form is insular, but at the same time multi-sectoral. It is present in every sector of the production system, in intellectually dense services, and even in precision or scientific agriculture, as well as in advanced manufacture. But in each sector, it appears as an island, excluding the vast majority of businesses and of workers. So at the limit, The small elite is in control of this vanguard, and everyone else in the society is condemned to some kind of make work, or is in the outer periphery, in the service penumbra of this vanguard. Now, it is an anomaly, I said, because it depends on the exploitation and combination of four sets of circumstances. First, these businesses have very large amounts of liquid capital with which they can fund the internalization of the technologies on which they depend. Second, they have these comprehensive, inclusive, almost universal platforms, the value of which lies precisely in their universality. And it's because of this characteristic of the value of the platform lies in its universality, the value to society, and not just the value to the stockholders, that they cannot easily be mastered simply by anti-competition law, by antitrust. The most promising initiatives have to do with the law of intellectual property or the law of corporate governance. They would be initiatives that represent the social interest in their governance, or initiatives that make them pay for the data which they traffic in gratuitously. And that then leads to the third characteristic of this anomalous corner of the economy, which is that its owners and masters do a business made possible by a lacuna, a gap in the law of intellectual property. They traffic in data which they can traffic in for free because there is no need to remunerate the use of that data. And the fourth characteristic is that they can, the near zero marginal cost of adding a user or a consumer to these universal platforms. So a progressive project would then include facing down these platform oligopolies and doing now, at the beginning of the 21st century, the equivalent of what the Americans did at the end of the 19th century in the trust-busting movement that culminated in the Sherman Act. So let's say that's the first stage. It's obviously a very confrontational stage because these are huge businesses with huge influence, with vast numbers of shareholders and powerful economic interests congregated around them. In the second stage, the crucial factor becomes labor. Labor vis-a-vis technology and labor vis-a-vis capital. In labor vis-a-vis technology, the priorities would be to interrupt three tendencies that are underway. The first tendency is to develop technology in a form that is most useful to mega enterprises, to the huge businesses, rather than to the small and medium-sized businesses that in fact are responsible for most jobs in the economy. The second tendency is to emphasize in the development of the technologies the replacement of labor by machines, rather than the combination of the replacement of labor by machines with the empowerment of labor by machines. All technological innovation replaces labor to some extent. The question is whether, in addition to replacing labor, it also empowers labor. And the third movement is to develop in the direction of taking as the goal to produce a proxy for the human mind. And that's the direction that's summarized under the conception of artificial general intelligence. As opposed to the direction of orienting artificial intelligence and the equivalent technologies not to replace the mind, but to be completely different from the mind and to complement the mind. So the machine has computational power. What the machine does not have is imagination. Now, what is imagination? The two moves of imagination are distancing from the phenomenon and subsumption of the phenomenon under a penumbra of adjacent variation, the accessible possible, through which we create the new, the perpetual creation of the new. And what we would want then, the third element, is to replace this tendency to try and mimic the human mind, to produce a surrogate mind, by to produce, as it were, the alternate reality. The worker with the machine should be much more powerful than the worker or the machine alone, to the extent that the machine is not a reproduction of the mind. The machine is something else, which then empowers the mind. Now, of course, the common assumption of these three disruptions, which I've just described, is that there is no imminent logic of technological evolution. Technology has no inbuilt logic. It has the logic that we give it. And I return to a comment that I made earlier, much earlier in the course, about the nature of technology. What is technology? In one sense, technology is the materialization of a channel between our experiments in the mobilization of natural forces to our benefit and our experiments in the organization of the technical division of labor, the way in which we cooperate at work. And that channel takes the material form of technology. In another sense, the second way of thinking about technology is technology is the marking of the division between what we have already learned how to repeat and what we have not yet learned how to repeat. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we embody the formula or the algorithm in the mechanical device. The point of the mechanical device is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our supreme resource, our time, for what we have not yet learned how to repeat. So this conception of technology as a combination of two sets of experiments then reveals the source of the indeterminacy in the evolution of technology. It shows why technology has no inbuilt logic of evolution, but rather only the logic that we give it. So that's technology vis-a-vis, labor vis-a-vis technology. Then there's labor vis-a-vis capital. And here we could distinguish between the international setting and the national one. There are radical differences in the returns to labor among the sovereign states of the world, among the different countries. By far the most powerful influence on these national differences in the returns to labor is labor mobility, the mobility of labor across national frontiers. If we ask ourselves what would modify these returns to labor, the answer is, in the medium and long run, technology, of course, the technology available to labor to make it productive. But in the short run, the ability of labor to cross national frontiers. And so the most important subject for cooperative arrangements among the sovereign states of the world, other than diminishing the likelihood of war, which is the most important object of international cooperation and governance, is cooperation to facilitate the movement of labor. That vastly overpowers every other influence on the diminishment of inequality and the returns to labor among nations. Now, obviously, we all know, reading the newspaper every day, Hegel described as the morning prayer of the realist, that this is an incendiary subject in the world. Advances in the mobility of labor across national frontier are only possible if they're gradual and if they're surrounded by compensations and safeguards. So there have to be compensations for the countries that send people, and there have to be safeguards for the countries that receive people. So countries have to be compensated for their investment in human resources. If they send engineers, technicians, having paid for their education, they have to be compensated for that. And on the other hand, the receiving countries have to have a system of providing access to labor in little gradual steps, beginning with work permits, advancing to prolonged residency, and only at the end, full citizenship. Most important space for the confrontation of the relation of labor to capital is the nation state. And within the nation state, the problem is that the main device of the 20th century, unionization or countervailing power, no longer works. Only a small fraction of the labor force is now unionized in most of the major economies of the world. And what is most alarming is that an increasing part of the labor force is relegated to some form of unstable, unsecure, and precarious employment. So, a minority of the labor force is in conditions of precarious, of relatively stable employment in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, and an increasing majority is then in the capital-starved parts of the economy, and without guarantees of stable employment. And this difference, this differentiation in the labor market between what is sometimes called the primary and the secondary part of the labor market, then results in radical wage dispersion, radical difference in the returns to labor within the nation state. So what can we do about that? We can have a kind of sliding scale in which we say, to the extent possible, we will use the new communication and information technologies to organize the precarious workers. But to the extent that we fail to organize them, there must be direct legal intervention in the employment relation. The theory of unionization, of countervailing power, of collective bargaining was that the employment contract threatens to be a facade of coercion if bargaining power is not equalized between the employer and the employee. Its form is the form of a contract, but it's the reality of vastly unequal bargaining power, transforming it into a coercive relationship. And that was then the theory. We'll right the inequality of bargaining power by allowing the workers to unionize and to strike. But now, if they're not unionized, and if we fail to find new ways in which they can organize, the law must intervene directly in the employment relationship. The ally of the worker must be the state. For example, through a principle of price neutrality in the labor contract that would say, if there has to be flexibility in the labor market, genuine flexibility, let's distinguish flexibility from the cheapening of labor. Flexibility would mean facility to hire and fire, but it should not mean the cheapening of the wage. So the law would say work performed under conditions of unstable employment must be remunerated at a level comparable to the similar work performed under conditions of stable employment. The idea is that the unstable or precarious labor has to be pushed up. And the only entity that can push it up is the state. Through the formation of a body of labor law adapted to this new reality. We're going to deal with this later on. So, labor vis-a-vis technology and labor vis-a-vis capital. What is the force behind this that can create these two movements? The force must come from the deepening, the energizing of democratic politics. And this is the place at which the link between a democratized market order and a high-energy democracy becomes most vital. I've already anticipated part of what I mean by the idea of a high-energy democracy, and we're going to come back to it in greater detail. Now we come to the long term. I said the short term, facing down the platform oligopolies. The medium term, dealing with the relation of labor to technology and the relation of labor to capital. And the short term is the transformation of the legal and institutional architecture of the market order. Going back to the very beginning of the course, and let me present the idea now in a historical form. So in the early 19th century, in the United States, for example, in the north of the United States, there was an economy of petty proprietors, artisans, tradespeople, little people. I said, one white man in 5 worked for another white man. Everyone was a petty capitalist, petty bourgeois. There was only a very small elite at the top. That economy was destroyed in the second half of the 20th century, of the 19th century. In the United States, in the aftermath of the Civil War. Why was it destroyed? It was destroyed because there was no way in that economy to achieve the aggregation of scale and scope, to scale up production and resources required by the advanced economy. John Stuart Mill invented the legal theory of the joint stock company as a response to this problem, imagining there would be an instrument for the small-scale proprietors and technicians to unite in businesses, to pool their resources, and to achieve economies of scale. And Karl Marx, on the contrary, believed it was impossible. It was impossible to reconcile radical economic decentralization with large scale, and on that basis came to deride the people whom he dismissed as utopian socialists or advocates of cooperation. This was the unsolved problem of the 19th century. In the end, massive aggregation of resources under the control of large corporations and the marriage of high finance to big business became the instrument for solving this problem and destroying the economy of the small-scale producers. So if you go back to, for example, Rawls's theory of justice, which I referred to a moment ago, after the theories of redistribution are enunciated, toward the end of the book, there appears a remarkable section on property-owning democracy, which Rawls says there he regards as superior to redistributive welfare state. But it is a conception that presupposes the solution to this unsolved problem. So that's the object of what I'm calling the third stage in the development of a knowledge economy for the many. The problem is reconciling a radical democratization or decentralization of access to productive resources and opportunities with a solution to the problem of scale. That can only be done, I want to argue, by separating the two problems. By separating the market as a decentralization device from the instruments for aggregation. Remember when I said at the most abstract level, a market has at least two dimensions. One dimension is absolute decentralization, the number of economic agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents enjoys over the resources at his command. Is the control perpetual or temporary? Is it conditional or absolute? Is it comprehensive or fragmentary? Market fundamentalism, which believes that the market has a single natural and necessary form, imagines that these two dimensions, absolute decentralization and absolute control, are inseparable. But of course, they're not inseparable. And in fact, there's a contradiction between them. One of the ways in which we can increase absolute decentralization is by limiting absolute control. For example, take a simple metaphor of having a time-sharing arrangement. If you have a time-sharing arrangement, more people can use the resource and more will have access. There'll be a democratization or decentralization of access because the absoluteness or the perpetual character of the control will be limited. Contemporary financial markets are based on the disaggregation of the property right. They are markets in derivatives of the property right, meaning the property right can be broken up into pieces, and you can have a market in some partial claim, some fragmentary claim. And that's the basic device, that's the basic character of a solution to this problem. And thus I came to the thought experiment evoked at the beginning of the course. Imagine that the resources of society are vested in social funds set up by the democratic institutions. And each of these social funds is a different way of auctioning off the capital resources of society, large pools of capital and of technology, auctioning off to the most effective users. And the auction is always temporary, so in principle, the capital taker has access to the resources only so long as he is the one who can use them most efficiently. So no one has permanent control of the means of production. The means of production are only temporarily owned. That's the generic character of the solution. And of course, in the actual technical organization of a capital auction, there are an infinite number of ways in which we can organize the time horizons, the risk profiles, and so forth. Now, what I say is this. I'm not proposing that the entire market order be organized in this way, through funds that auction off the capital resources of society. The fundamental proposition is that there is no natural way of organizing a market order. There should be a range of ways. And one of those ways should be the traditional property right of the 19th century. Because I said, the traditional property right of the 19th century, bringing together all the component powers of property and vesting them in the same right holder, the owner, the absolute owner, has a great advantage. The advantage is that it allows the owner to do, at his own risk, something that no one else believes in without having to negotiate a series of vetoes or agreements with other stakeholders. And for that reason alone, we would always want the absolute property right of the 19th century to be one of the devices of economic decentralization, but never the only device. So we have a democratized capital auction. There are different ways of auctioning off capital. They compete, and we observe their consequences. And experimentally then, we develop some forms and turn off other forms, and we evolve experimentally and empirically. That whole idea is the very opposite, the inverse of the idea of market fundamentalism. The idea of market fundamentalism is there is a single natural and necessary way of organizing a market. If there's a spontaneous system of exchange, like Robinson Crusoe, it will reveal itself to have a latent legal object. That's the idea that I'm denouncing as false. And I pointed out that the idea of the capital auction is in fact the thesis of orthodox finance theory, because the thesis of orthodox finance theory is that a perfectly competitive capital market, in fact, allocates financial resources to the most effective users. But what the idea of the fund of the capital auction does is not to take that on faith, but actually to test that it happens in fact. So then viewed dynamically, this project of creating a knowledge economy for the many, to replace the knowledge economy for the few, goes through these stages. Confronting the platform oligopolies, exploiting the multiple possibilities in the evolution of technology, and empowering labor vis-a-vis technology and vis-a-vis capital. And finally, far into the future, the speculative guide the pluralization, the experimental deconstruction and reconstruction of the democratized, decentralized access to capital. That's the basic conception. The idea is that a knowledge economy for the many would never emerge spontaneously. It's the result of an attempt to create something new through institutional experiment. And because it is an alternative to the path of least resistance, the insular knowledge economy, which is an adaptation of the technologies and practices of the knowledge economy to the dominant interests and the dominant ideas, it has to result from a struggle, an ideological struggle, a political struggle. That, in a nutshell, is the idea. As opposed to the situation in which the elite of Silicon Valley looks around and says, why aren't the rest like us? All we have to do is give them technical education, for example. Or the Republican governors in the United States, all of whom have their little industrial policies. They want their little Silicon Valleys. As if by creating the same Potemkin village in each state of the Union, they could magically reproduce the formula of the knowledge economy. Once you go beyond those simple solutions, everything is conflictual and complicated. Now, a crucial element in this idea is the evocation of the social agent. Who is the agent? The agent is the group which early in the course I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So I said, the vast majority of people in the world are poor and disorganized, but their perspective of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. What do they want? What do they desire? They desire to have a little farm, a shop, a trade for which they can charge a fee. So by default, in the absence of another expression of their aspiration, they're driven back to isolated, archaic family business. Which only provides a modest level of survival to them and offers no growth miracle to their country. For there to be a growth miracle, I argued, there has to be a division in the national elite, and a productivist counter-elite opposed to the predominant elite of rentiers, of financial rentiers or natural resource rentiers, has to form, seek power, and winning power, offer this subjective petty bourgeoisie an alternative to their default form of isolated, archaic family business. Now, in the early stages, it does not appear as some radical different form of economic life. It's simply that same family business, but with a higher level of technology, of productivity. But it sets it on a train, on an escalator of progressive transformation. Solving the problem which John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx were unable to solve, of reconciling this radical decentralization, the formation of this mass of people who are not in big factories, not employed by large corporations, and are the majority of humanity, and giving them the instruments, the means of production. I think for the progressives, for the leftists, the problem begins in the antipathy to the petty bourgeoisie. After all, in the 20th century, the left elected the petty bourgeoisie as its enemy. But now there are more petty bourgeois in the world than there are proletarians. And if you define the petty bourgeoisie subjectively, rather than objectively as members of a small business class, they're the vast majority of humanity. So there is no progressive alternative possible without a transformation of the material situation and of the consciousness of this subjective petty bourgeoisie. That's a summary of the different elements of the argument about the relation of the advanced sector to the rest. Now, what do you think? Yes. Speak really loud.
Structural change.
Structural change.
Yeah. The meaning of that.
Uh-huh.
You just find like it's a slope-based process. Like the formula is like a fragmentary process against Marxist.
Structure, not system. Yes.
Yeah, but at the same time, you also defend the presidential regime. Because it provides like a shortcut to power, allowing significant changes and almost in control. So I'd like to ask you, it seems to me that structural change is more closely associated to parliamentary regime, which is also slow-paced and fragmentary and so on. And what do you think about this?
No, well, I'd like to postpone the discussion of regimes, of political regimes, because we are going to deal with that further. But why do you think that parliamentary systems are more conducive to structural change?
Because how they work, how like politics are being made there, is closer to your definition of structural change.
So I think you could say that there are regimes that generally are regimes of party government, and the parties have programs, and the programs can focus on institutional innovation. That might be an argument you would have, but it's not clear why you would think that there's this affinity of parliamentary regimes to structural change. Why? I mean, compare it to the problem in a presidential regime is, this is a very specific problem, right? We're talking about now, the politics of structural change. And the question is, how politics should be organized for structural change. So in countries that are large, complicated, like the United States or like Brazil, the presidential regime creates an avenue to the center of power, a quick route to the center of power. The Madisonian presidential regime, however, has a problem. It creates this avenue to power, but then when the political agent arrives in power, he finds his hands tied. Because it was a regime designed by Madison and his peers to slow politics down. That is, their assumption was that this society in which they lived, in which in the South there were slaves, in the North there were petty proprietors, was the natural society. And that they should insulate the economic order from constant destabilization by politics or from populist and demagogic adventurism, from Caesarism. And so they deliberately created this slow politics, this low-energy politics, the proto-democratic liberalism, which is the character of the American Constitution. So that's why one might want to maintain the presidential regime because of its advantage of rapid access to the center of power, but to cure it of its defect of perpetuating impasse by equipping it with arrangements for the rapid resolution of impasse through anticipated elections, through comprehensive plebiscites, and so forth. That would be the basic logic. But that logic is not universal or permanent. That's just an adaptation to a particular historical circumstance of particular countries. So the parliamentary regime might then, at a later moment, be the best solution because it relies on parties, it gives power to parties and collective programs. It diminishes the personalist element in politics. Those all make it attractive. So it's not an argument in favor of presidentialism or parliamentarianism. I think there's no decisive advantage of regimes. Take another subject of proportional and first past the post representation. So you have a society like in a country like the United States, for example, where the political parties have no strong programmatic or ideological identity, proportional representation might be useful because it allows the formation of parties that are ideologically coherent. But in a country like, say, Italy, which has historically had many parties that are fossilized and sectarian, it's the opposite. You might want first past the post representation for a certain time to break up the rule of the parties and the party's sectarianism and free up the system. So there's no permanent advantage to one system or another. Going back to the more general point of structure and structural change. Structural change is change of the institutional arrangements and of the ideological assumptions associated with them. We have been in the world through 200 or 300 years in which the main theme of ideological conflict was the market versus the state. More market, less state, more state, less market, or synthesis of market and state, that's social liberalism or social democracy. Now, a different focus of ideological conflict is emerging in the world. And the idea is that economic pluralism, the market order, political pluralism, democracy, and social pluralism, an independent civil society, all have alternative forms. And the subject of struggle is not the market versus the state. It's the alternative forms of economic, political, and social pluralism. To that end, we need to generate a repertoire of these alternative arrangements, and to understand that the arrangements that are now established in the world are a subset of a much larger universe of possibilities. That's the point. Does that help clarify your question? Yes.
Yes, I wonder, could you clarify how should the commitment to the intervention in employment relationship be squared with a realist acceptance that the society now is rife with subjective petit bourgeois? Because if we accept the latter truth, then it follows that the constituency of the precarious workers is small, and perhaps it's not being worth picked up on by the more far-sighted progressives. Or perhaps should we think instead of interventions not just in the employment relationship, but also in the institutions of business-to-business interactions or institutions that regulate the interactions between sole traders and big business, etc., etc.
But what's the nub of your question? Where's the issue?
Can we think of, can we be committed to restructuring the labor and capital relationship and still pick up the cause of the proletariat while we remain aware that everyone just wants to be a petit bourgeois and doesn't want to have a straightforward employment relationship?
I think, but the idea is a spectrum, right? So you have the worker starts as the employee of a corporation, and he ends up as being a semi-autonomous operator, a franchisee, for example, like an Uber driver. In this space in which a large part of the labor force are neither employees nor completely independent proprietors. It's not that they want permanently to have an independent entrepreneurial existence. It's that the idea of forming a family business, opening a restaurant, for example, opening a shop, is the enclave to which they resort against the storms of the economic world. And so that's the reality of labor. Labor is not just, labor is not the opposite of the entrepreneur. The small-scale entrepreneur is a worker. Now, this was quite obvious in agriculture because the small holder, the small farmer, was very clearly both a worker and an entrepreneur. but it's less obvious in a non-agrarian setting. But it's fundamentally the same problem, isn't it? I think it's the same problem.
It is, but yeah, I just wonder if there is a particular sequence that you have in mind in terms of imagining these steps, because it's not anymore the case that the starting point is one of standard economic relationship. Like you said, if I were
So to come to this question from a different angle, progressive structural change is only going to happen in an atmosphere of economic progress. And will be favored by, if not dependent on, growth miracles, big advances in productivity and in output. Now, if the vast majority of the labor force is in small shops and in family business, how can that happen? It seems that it can only happen in the vanguard of big business like the platform oligopolies. What about all the rest? 90% of the population is in the small shops. So the advance has to happen by the elevation of the small shops. That's the basic idea. That there has to be a heightening of productivity beginning in this backward world of the vast economic penumbra. That they have to be susceptible to this gradual elevation. So we don't have this binary idea that it's either 21st century tech or it's some kind of primitive 19th century petty bourgeois life. That's the problem. The primitive 19th century thing, the archaic, isolated family business, has to be put on an escalator in which it's lifted up. And obviously, the economic lifting up can only be part of a more general lifting up. But this isn't a new problem. This is a problem which has been brewing since the early 19th century. It just happened that in the second half of the 19th century, we accepted the proposition that the wage contract is the natural form of free labor. That was not accepted in the early 19th century. In the early 19th century, the universal assumption of liberals and socialists was that there are three forms of free labor: self-employment, cooperation, and wage, the wage contract. And the view was that the wage contract was an inferior, defective form of free labor, retaining many of the characteristics of serfdom and slavery. This was the view, for example, that Abraham Lincoln states in his address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society a few years before the Civil War. But in the 19th century, it was the general view. Wage labor only came to be accepted as the natural and predominant form of free labor at the end of the 19th century. And then we came to have this world in which we think the natural form of the economy is we're going to have these big corporations, factories, large workforces in factories, and so forth. That was the world of Fordist mass production. Now, what happens then in the world, in the insular knowledge economy? Does it continue toward the big, toward the concentration? No, I don't think so. On the contrary, many of the businesses of the insular knowledge economy are so-called fabless. That is, they have no physical apparatus, and their masters have discovered a way to divide the process of production. They keep the creative and lucrative core for themselves, and they subcontract the rest to workers and firms in remote parts of the world. So instead of continuing on this trajectory of concentration, it's the opposite. There may be financial concentration, but in productive apparatus, it's labor is being returned to a system of decentralized contractual arrangements. The labor market is being organized globally on a new putting out system. You know, Karl Marx in the early chapters of Das Kapital describes the putting out system. Putting out system is the capitalist gives the sewing machine or whatever the machine is to the workers. The worker works at home with his family and friends. That's the putting out system. And it's an organization of work not under the aegis of a corporate entity, but in a set of contractual arrangements. Now we have a new putting out system on a global scale. And that's the new world of labor. So the problem is we're not going to find the worker in the form in which we think of him. We imagine the worker as someone in a factory working for a corporation. That's a small minority of humanity. Most of humanity are these subjective petty bourgeois. We can't really call them petty bourgeois because they're poor. But they are the victims or the participants in these decentralized contractual arrangements. That's where we have to find them. And the idea is not to replace them by Stalinist mega enterprises, but to set them in some kind of upward trajectory and rescue them from this situation of archaic, low productivity in which they find themselves. This is a problem which must perplex the whole world. And I'm not suggesting that it's an easy problem to solve. But unless we face that problem, nothing else can be solved. That's the difficulty with which I'm contending here. Now, what else? So the next subject would be the relation of labor to capital, actually. And a good place to begin is what we were just discussing now in this exchange. So I said, the premise up to the middle of the 19th century was the higher forms of free labor are self-employment and cooperation. The lower form of free labor is wage labor. Now wage labor, at the end of the 19th century, came to be regarded as the natural form of free labor, which it never was. And now let me discuss how the labor problem has been dealt with in these modern economies. So let's distinguish the organized sector and the unorganized sector. Now, in the organized sector, the solution was countervailing power. Just as I said before, employment relation is a realm of economic duress, threatening to reduce the employment contract to a facade. And behind the facade, the reality is economic coercion because of the vast disparity of bargaining power between the employer and the employee. And the solution then was organize the workers. In order to equalize the bargaining power between the employers and the employer, restoring the reality of contract in the employment situation. Now, actually, there are two labor law regimes that developed in the 20th century, not just one. In most of the world, and especially in the rich North Atlantic region, collective bargaining. But in part of the world, and especially in Latin America, the corporatist labor law regime. There's a contractualist labor law regime and a corporatist labor law regime. The corporatist labor law regime was initially inspired by Italian fascism, by Mussolini's Carta del Lavoro of 1934. But adopted in Latin America by populist, nationalist, left-leaning regimes. By Cardenas in Mexico, by Vargas in Brazil, and by Perón in Argentina. The contractualist labor law regime is based on two principles. One is that the labor contract is that the decision to unionize is purely voluntary. The union is a voluntary organization based on collective choice and on the choice of the individual workers who collectively decide or not to unionize. The second principle is that the unions are completely independent from the state. Those are the two principles of the contractualist system, collective bargaining. The two principles of the corporativist system are, first, everyone is automatically unionized according to his job. The main criterion typically is sectoral, your function in the production system, and the subsidiary criterion is territorial. And the second principle of the corporatist regime is that the labor union system, the whole system, is under the tutelage of the state, typically through a Ministry of Labor. So it's what the political scientists call controlled popular mobilization. Mass mobilization to create a constituency for the caudillo, the leader, manipulated and financed through the state. Now, of course, the premise in the North Atlantic world is that the contractualist system is obviously superior because the corporatist system has all these residues and influences of fascism and of controlled mass mobilization. But it's not so simple. And there's not such an obvious preference for the following reasons. The first is that under the contractualist system, unionization is a permanent struggle, which has to be constantly rekindled. The struggle to unionize, to stay unionized, to maintain the union. It's like the struggle of Sisyphus to roll up the hill. Under the corporatist system, the fact of unionization is a gift of the law. Unionization is automatic. You're automatically unionized. You don't have to struggle to unionize. The struggle then becomes over how to use the power that the law gives you, not how to acquire the power. Second, in a hierarchical production system, which includes capital-intensive sectors and capital-starved sectors, the tendency of the contractualist regime is to express and amplify the underlying structural divisions of the production system. And therefore expose and accentuate the differences of interest between the workers in the advanced capital-intensive sectors and the workers in the retrograde capital-poor sectors. The workers in a capital-intensive business are to some extent partners with their employers. Typically, the wage bill is a limited part of the cost of the enterprise. And in fact, the workers, for example, the workers in Microsoft, they're partners with the managers. And the third characteristic of the contractualist system is that the contractualist system has an inbuilt bias to economism in the claims that are made by the unions. The tendency of the corporatist of the contractualist system is to produce economistic unions, focused solely on wages and benefits, and not on the larger institutional political setting of the union movement, which is the tendency of the corporatist system. So the corporatist system has advantages, but of course it's unacceptable in its fascistic origin and as an instrument of mass mobilization. So there's a solution, and the solution is a typical example of what structural change can be like. The solution is to say, we'll just split the difference. We'll take from the contractualist system the principle of complete autonomy of the workers from the state, and we'll take from the corporatist system the principle of automatic unionization of everyone. So everyone will be automatically unionized. And then there will be different movements, labor movements, within this union system. The whole population is unionized. And these different movements have different ideologies, and they're affiliated or not with political parties. and they compete for position in the unitary union structure just as political parties compete for position in the unitary structure of a democratic state. There's nothing wrong with that. So then we would have a hybrid regime, which is part corporatist and part contractualist. That's an example of structural change, resulting in a simple form from the combination of these two regimes, and would seem to be a very good idea. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that the disorganization of the union system and the transformation of production in the age of the insular knowledge economy has now already gone so far that it seems too late. So it is a solution, but it's a solution for a world that may have already ceased to exist. And that shows you that there's no pre-established harmony, that the institutional inventions don't automatically come quickly enough. They may be too late. So that would be for the organized sector. The best solution for the organized sector, in principle, would be a combination of the corporatist and the contractualist regimes. But it may be too late, because now the vast majority of workers is in the unorganized sector, just as we were discussing before. And in the unorganized sector, then you need a completely different principle. So there, you need what I call the sliding scale. We'll say, we'll try to organize them. They're unorganized, we'll try to organize them anyway, using our new technical resources. And to the extent that we can't organize them, we'll have a direct legal intervention in the employment relation. And the object of the direct legal intervention in the employment relation will be to prevent the legitimate or unavoidable flexibility in the labor market from turning into a device or an excuse for the cheapening of the wage. The cheapening of the wage is a disaster, not just on distributive grounds, but because a high innovation economy, an economy of inclusive innovation, requires an upward tilt to the wage. There cannot be inclusive innovation in an economic circumstance of cheapening labor. You have to press upward. That's why, to take the extreme example, there can't be technological innovation in a slave economy. If labor is cheap, there's no technological innovation. A crucial economic element in the creation of inclusive innovation economy is an upward tilt to the wage. So how will we administer this upward tilt to the wage in the conditions of the disorganization of the labor market? We would have to have something like this principle of price neutrality that I mentioned today. We won't prohibit you from hiring and firing, but we will require you to distinguish legitimate flexibility or indispensable flexibility from illegitimate cheapening of the wage. Okay? You can hire or fire. You can have these precarious workers, but you have to pay them comparably to the similar work that is done under conditions of stable employment in the primary labor market. So the desirable solution of the hybrid labor law regime, combining the corporatist and contractualist systems, is probably prejudiced by the historical moment. It's gone too far in the disorganization of the labor market. And then you have to appeal to this ad hoc solution of creating a legal backup through legal intervention of the state in the employment relation to administer an upward tilt to the wage. Now, all of that is to suggest that this isn't like a system. It's real history. The things don't occur in the order in which you would like them to occur. As in this disaster that I mentioned, in which the right labor law regime didn't appear. So, for example, the contractualist regime seemed by the Americans as superior because it's their ideology. So the AFL-CIO and the Democratic Party sent operatives throughout Latin America to propagandize for collective bargaining and attack the corporatist labor law regime. And they argued then for the adoption of labor laws that would make unionization optional. And that then contributed to the destructuring, the subversion of the unions in the major Latin American republics. Pure ideological illusion. They didn't understand. They were talking about something that they didn't understand, which was the corporativist labor law regime. It's fascism. So I think that's a very interesting example because it shows you the feet of clay of real structural change. It's not something done in heaven. It's all this confusion. The people don't understand what the options are. They don't understand the logic of the different regimes. They only understand what they know. And then the solution comes too late in some cases and too early in others. There's not some kind of heavenly coordination. It's the real thing. But when we come back to labor, the fundamental questions are the ones I stated. The relation of labor to capital and the relation of labor to technology. The principle should be, in a free society, no one should be condemned to do work that could be done by a machine. So if it can be done by a machine, it shouldn't be done by a human being. The machine is to do what we have learned how to repeat. The human being with imagination is perpetually to create the new. That has to be the ideal. And the purpose of the machine is to preserve for us, is to allow us to preserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. Now, what about my argument concerning labor and the organized and disorganized sectors? Do you see the immense advantages of a labor law regime in which everyone is automatically unionized? Then you have the union. The union is a gift of the law. You don't have to struggle for it every day. You struggle about what to do with it. You have the resource. You have the power. And you have this solidaristic tilt in the union movement. Instead of having a union movement in which the unions express and amplify the underlying hierarchical divisions of the production system, which is the consequence of the contractual system. So now when we have in the world this global putting out system, which there are 100,000 people in California in the tech oligopolies. And they're finding a way to subcontract the routinized and commoditized part of the production process to 10 million people in China who are working in these Fordist or pre-Fordist factories and a command and control system. It's a vicious arrangement. So the struggle to form a knowledge economy for the many, they could replace a knowledge economy for the few, is mixed up with the struggle to redefine the relation between labor and capital. Would someone be willing to make a remark about this? A progressive political economic project is very unlikely to occur outside of the setting of a growth miracle. It has to be a flood, an upward surge of productivity, of creation. And the subject matter, the people who are the agents, if they're not in that tech elite, that little insular vanguard, are these petty bourgeois, the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So this is the real thing. The constituency of a progressive movement is the person who opened a laundromat or a restaurant, who has a little shop. This refractory world of family business. based on family saving and self-exploitation. That's not what the leftists want. They don't want to, that's not the part of humanity that they want, that they fantasize about. But that's the reality. And from that profane, unpromising, unfashionable reality is we have to build a future. It should be something within the powers of a Christian civilization to conceive, because after all, one of the themes of Christianity is that the ordinary, the vulgar, has more promise than the noble. So we have one more class to deal with the